Live from the SABC's Auckland Park studios, my name is Vuyo Mvogo, and this is the Watchdog. On the show tonight,
details on our interventions with regard to the social security net will be provided in the February 2022 budget. Yavaga, indeed. Lo mbuzo abantu bawubuza esitrateni uyawuphendula kwangilo rhulumente kodwa ndayithetha loo nto ngoFebruary.
Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana mum about the basic income grant and other social relief measures to help the poor. What could be behind kicking the can down the road? Our panel weighs in. Hero or saint or neither? We look at the life and legacy of F.W. de Klerk. All of that coming up in tonight's episode of The Watchdog, which starts right now. South Africans have spent the day first talking about their expectations, then listening to, and thereafter discussing the Finance Minister's medium-term budget statement. Now, when the practice of releasing a medium-term budget statement was started back 25 years ago, the government said it wanted to give us a line of sight into what to expect for the next 3 years. Now, in a year that has seen record high unemployment levels, accompanied by rising levels of poverty and inequality, made worse by a debilitating pandemic, expectations were high that the minister would give at least a sense of the government's thinking about it all, in particular, the basic income grant that is now in everyone's lips. Alas, it was not to be. Well, here's the little that the minister could say about the basic income grant.
The 2021 medium-term budget policy statement is about navigating South Africa's path to economic and social recovery, drawing on the resilience of our people, as well as restoring the sustainability of our public finances and the dignity of our people in the face of a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic. The medium-term budget policy statement charts a course that demonstrates government's unflinching commitment to fiscal sustainability, enabling long-term growth by narrowing the budget deficit and stabilizing the debt. Critical to the fiscal path we've chosen is the need to be clear and unambiguous on the trade-offs we're willing to make as a nation. We cannot do everything we want at the same time.
We cannot do everything we want at the same time. Please welcome our panelists for this evening, analysts Lebohang Pego and Duma Gubule, who has just been load-shared, who's going to join us on the telephone line. Good evening to both of you. Thanks very much for your time. There are trade-offs, Ms. Pego. We can't do everything at the same time.
Well, it depends on what our priorities actually are, and to the viewers. So I think that when we look at South Africa as a grant social policy regime, and I think, or a social spending policy regime, it's got a few key objectives. The one is redistribution. The other is the reproduction of labor. And the other one is protection, right? It's about social protection. And we have, as a country, been talking about this social compact or social contract for quite some time. And we should also bear in mind that any such intervention, any social protection, works in tandem, it works in alliance with economic policy and in alliance with socioeconomic growth, mainly because it's understood that for a country to function effectively, it really has to be able to ensure that its citizens and its working citizens, its children, its elderly, its sick, basically everybody, right, has access to healthcare, access to food, has shelter, access to clean water, the very fundamentals of human dignity. And when we, especially because we live in a so-called rights-based democracy, these are things that are really non-negotiable. So they're really part of citizenship and our basic humanity. So I think when we say we can't do everything at the same time, it really depends on whether or not we want to neglect, which proportion of the population is going to be neglected and for how long.
Duma Kubula, your thoughts on that line?
Yeah, I actually don't know what to say, Wenavuya, but we can't do everything at the same time. But what was disappointing to me about this budget is that between 2009 and 2019, we had a lost decade during which GDP per capita did not grow. And then after a technical rebound of the economy this year, the forecast is that our growth will revert to pre-pandemic low growth of 1.7% a year, which barely covers the population growth. So if you look at the latest forecast from the IMF, it says 1.5% a year from 2022 to 2026. So what does that look like to me? It looks like, number one, the government doesn't believe its own recovery plan that it will generate growth. And secondly, that we could be heading on this trajectory towards a second lost decade in terms of economic development. Now, we are already at an unviable society with 74.8% unemployment amongst youth and 48.7% Black Africans, 53%, and so forth, amongst Black African females. Now, can you imagine what type of a country we will be in 2030, since it is quite clear from the government's own forecasts that we are on this trajectory of low growth?
Ms. Peko, this is very interesting, especially what Aduma said in the latter part of his response, because when the minister started talking about the things that need to happen for us to get into a place where, he is able to make longer-term commitments. Remember, he warned that saying we were able to, disburse those 350 rands and other things on the back of a commodity boom that we didn't expect. So we used that windfall to finance, that social relief program that was exacerbated by the pandemic. He then said, because we have no guarantee that we will be able to do that, or that is going to be sustained, we cannot therefore make long-term commitments.
Mm-hmm. So it's the same argument which suggests that if there's a more permanent revenue stream for the budget, to budget for social grant or social expenditure, it's going to then have some kind of a drag on the fiscus. And this other, I think the other red herring in the room is the notion that this commodity price windfall was the reason in the first place that the grants were extended. And that's not the case. The grants were extended because we came into an unprecedented, and we've been using that word an unprecedented number of times, but a previously unforeseen situation where there is a global pandemic, which is also a pandemic of pandemics. So I think for about a year and a half, quite a few of us have been saying that this is really illustrative of previous existing fault lines, fragilities, and that what this has done is really to bring them under the magnifying glass one more time. So to suggest that, in fact, the only reason that these grants were extended is because of this, this Father Christmas commodity windfall is a bit problematic, to say the least, particularly because we understand now that there has also been the attempt to then put in place this efficiency argument around the family grants, so that that this is going to be, there's a kind of a matrix that's being used to measure the percentage of income growth resulting from from these sort of family grants. But the problem with that is that, like anything else, if you're going to use an efficiency model, it must be measurable, it must be finite, and there must be some science to it. Now, if the things that these grants are responding to, which are the big three, poverty, inequality, and unemployment, are not measurable. To date, there has not been any science to dealing with them, to diminishing them, to chipping away at them. So to use an efficiency model for what has been a hugely inefficient economic practice of spending as much as possible, keeping interest rate low, chasing inflation, this sort of Bretton Woods inspired, very external, neoliberal framework, and then expect somehow that this trickle down theory, that the benefits of all of this are going to somehow then come down to the population who have been poor, not only for this generation, but they've been indigent intergenerationally. And lastly, to say that, bear in mind also that these social grants are part of social governance. Now, remember that the local government were given a dispensation and some extension last year to then provide water and sanitation to particular areas because of the requirement for us to practice more increased sanitation during this time. So it begs the question, what were they actually doing all this time? So to really try to then place an efficiency model on inefficiently run government and local government is just, it strikes me as slightly disingenuous, to say the very least.
And Duma, I'm sure we can add to what Lebohang just said, all the things that the minister said, and he's not the first minister to say this, about structural reforms, the energy situation, tourism, he spoke about EU visas, and all those things that are supposed to have been done a long time ago and which still haven't been done. I mean, who do you blame, for that?
Last time I was on the show with you, you were asking the same question to the previous Minister of Finance, Peter Mboweni. The National Treasury has been talking from the script of structural reform for more than a decade. You also, I remember last time you talked about this, the spectrum thing has been going on for a decade and maybe 10 ministers. So, why should we believe that it will happen this time? But then, if you look at the structural reforms that have happened, the embedded generation, the lifting of the licensing threshold, what we should remember is that our investment rate is 13.7% of GDP. The shortfall for us to meet the target in the new National Development Plan is 900 billion rands a year. So what we're seeing now is that these structural reforms, the lifting of the licensing threshold, the bid window 5, and also the Transnet structural reforms, they do not add up to much, according to my calculation. They will only close 5% of the annual shortfall. So I think the government must be putting more to the table in terms of lifting this economy.
Well, Lebohang, does the tough talk around, no longer keen or prepared to bail out SOEs that are of no real strategic importance, offer any solace, or any hope, that things are going to get better instead of getting worse?
Yeah, we've been hearing about the tough love for quite some time, particularly because right now Eskom and the Energy Security Compact are really key to this discussion. A lot of us are in the dark at the moment or about to be in the dark as a result of this. And it goes much more deeply than this. It goes to the heart of what the function of state-owned enterprises actually is, the reasons that they were constructed in the first place, which we have spoken about in the past, the fact that many of them have not been adequately rationalized during the last 50, 60 years, the fact that after 1994, many of the old inefficiencies were just carried over into this dispensation, and the warning signs, which were long flagged, were not at all heeded. So, that many of our energy reserves were depleting, that we needed to move from fossil fuels in the near future, that we needed to migrate to natural, to wind and solar energy. This is not really rocket science. But lastly as well, that, a relationship that the state has had with state-owned enterprises over the last 5, 10, or 15 years is one that I think in the public perceptions has been basically a slush fund. And I mean, I've said this on record many times before, and I don't mind saying it once more, that the deployment that has taken place there, where you don't have the best person for the job, but rather that you have deployees who, whether at board level or administrative level, normally at board level, across most state-owned enterprises, have then led to the kinds of inefficiencies that we're seeing now. So, for example, tenders which were put out without due diligence, and oftentimes upon second inspection, there was one quite notorious one, which upon second inspection, it was found that it would have gone out for about 2 trillion rands, and yet when it was then, the due diligence was then re-evaluated, it was discovered that it had been double invoiced. And how one wonders that if that was picked up, how many have not been picked up over the years with most of these SOEs? And I think that the drama of the unfortunate part of SOEs is that many of them are supposed to be the backbone of enabling this very important nexus between social infrastructure, economic infrastructure, skills creation, and job creation to take place. So trains are supposed to run efficiently to enable us to get to work efficiently so that we can leave our cars at home, so that we will then begin to relieve the lag of our own carbon footprints every time we jump on the road. So that this interconnectedness between what we should be doing, what we know should be doing, and how it's done, and the complete inefficiency of some of the state-owned enterprises, and the lack of commitment, I think, of the state in pulling the plug has been really unfortunate. And I will believe when I see that the tough love is indeed being implemented.
With regard to the one SOE, Duma, that is frustrating all of us right now, I sensed a bit of frustration on the part of the minister, hopelessness even, whenever he had to, answer a question around ESCOM, especially during the post-statement interviews. The minister saying, they have been saying the same things over and over again. If you listened to what ESCOM executives had to say 9, 10 years ago, it's all being regurgitated as we speak.
Yes. Okay. So this thing has been going on for 14 years, and I think South Africans have lost patience with the whole situation at Eskom. We heard the problems around maintenance this week, and regularly 15 gigawatts, or 40% of the power is offline, and it is a crisis. We need some kind of emergency situation to address this issue, because there can't be any economic development without electricity. For example, today, I've been load shed 3 times. This is the 3rd time that I'm getting load shed. You can't function like that as a country.
But Lohang, I mean, notwithstanding, a lot of the self-inflicted problems, notwithstanding the fact that, the government didn't deliver on promises it made, and a lot of things that were actually within their means or the government's ambit to actually deal with speedily. Does the minister really have any room to maneuver to deliver on the things that, people like you have been saying it can deliver on, including, of course, the issue of social grants?
Yeah, so that's another red herring, because we keep hearing that there has been either wasteful expenditure or unaccounted expenditure, or that there are rollovers at various government departments to the tune of many billions of rands per year across different departments, including, by the way, interestingly enough, the very same Ministry of Finance, which is quite a head-scratcher for me. But I do think as well that, the things around that they keep on pursuing, like improvement in fiscal and debt ratio, relying on things like, random things which are quite exogenous, that are external to us, like commodity boom prices, which we have no control over. And then, of course, the insistence that we can always trim the public wage sector bill, which is, again, another red herring, because remember that the public wage sector bill is not just the DGs and the people who earn quite significant amounts of money in the top, the upper echelons of government. That's police officers, that's the nurses who are managing us through this very difficult pandemic, that's state doctors, that is teachers who are teaching, frankly, under siege conditions a lot of the time. So I think we should be very mindful of that the idea that it's the public sector which is actually the one that is causing the problem, because that is really exactly the kind of prescript that your IMFs, your World Banks in the 1970s and 80s were proposing, which is very close to structural adjustment. And, when we're thinking about this momentum that needs to get behind so-called structural reform, I do think that it's also important to avoid global comparison, because we keep hearing as well that we're lagging behind the world. I was listening to another show on my way here, which was saying that South Africa's economy is very small in terms of internationally, in terms of the rest of the world. I mean, who is the world? Frankly speaking, because we're the second, well, depending on who's asking and which day of the week, we are either the first, second, or third largest economy on this continent. And I do think that the problem with us saying that there's not enough money to go around is in creating false comparisons, creating false scarcity, and not wanting to take accountability for the wastage or the mismanagement, or indeed the misdirecting of funds that is indeed taking place. There certainly is more than enough money to enable citizens in this country to live the dignified lives that they deserve. And lastly, to say that, by the way, this money is not some kind of a Santa Claus state. I think one of the things that's quite irksome in listening to budgets is that to bear in mind that is our money. Those are our funds. We pay taxes, whether as wage earners, whether as purchasers. Everybody pays some form of a tax. Even a person who's buying one cigarette is paying some form of a tax. Somebody who's buying a loaf of bread is paying some kind of a tax. And I do wish that the state would be much more circumspect in their tone, which is sometimes quite paternalistic and behaves as though this is some kind of a Santa Claus state and we're doing you favors. The state is supposed to do these things. It's supposed to provide stability, fiscal stability. It is supposed to provide an environment for jobs to be created, if not per se creating jobs, but create a thriving economy for small businesses in particular, which hire 75 to 80% of the population, which contribute to 60% of GDP growth. That is what the state is supposed to be doing, and there has to be funding for that.
Tumakubula, from where you sit, does the minister have the fiscal space?
Well, you know what? After we rebased our GDP at the end of August, there was more fiscal space. So the debt to GDP ratio is now 70.7% from 80%. After the government had cash of 333.9 billion rands, and as they showed in the budget, it's 65% of GDP net loan debt. There is no universe in which that is a high debt ratio, even when benchmarked against upper middle income countries. World average debt to GDP ratio increased by 15 percentage points to 99% in December 2020 from 83.5% last year. The advanced economy average is 123%. Emerging markets is 64%. Every country in the world had a similar shock to GDP and tax revenues. In relative terms, we are where we were before the crisis. If you compare other upper middle income countries, Angola 137%, Argentina 103%, Brazil 99%, Egypt 90%, India 90%, Sri Lanka 101%, Pakistan 89%. So on what basis do people say that we have a high debt ratio? There is no tipping point at which a rising debt ratio results in collapse. I believe we have a growth problem, not a debt problem. If we increase the size of our economy, the GDP, the bottom part of the debt ratio, the debt will take care of itself. So we're focusing on the wrong thing. I think the government has got much fiscal space. Imagine you're an investor and you're investing in South African bonds or Indian bonds, or are we not going to invest in South Africa because we have 70% debt ratio? No, that's not the situation. So I think that the debt fear-mongering must stop, and we must ask the right question. What will it take to reverse this long trend since 2009 of no growth? It's more than a lost decade now, because we haven't had economic GDP per capita growth for about 12 or 13 years. What will it take to reverse that situation? And there's no way out of it except for us to invest in our people, provide humanitarian support to the people, and invest in infrastructure, invest in job creation,
I mean, perhaps something that is not being made very clear then, Lebohang, just on the back of what Duma just said, or that hasn't been made obvious, is perhaps what the correlation is between, taking care of the poor, including, among other things, the idea of a basic income grant, and actually growing the economy. I mean, for those of us who are, novices, who don't know, the science behind, economics and those things, perhaps that is something that hasn't been made obvious, which probably gives a rise or prominence to what Duma calls, debt fear-mongering.
Yeah, it's linked to this psychology of scarcity, and it's the sort of thing that parents say to their children when children want to have Christmas in the middle of July. And it's a very, again, quite a paternalistic approach and a very top-down approach to managing the state fiscus. Yeah. And remember that, there was already quite a large and generous support package, which sadly was not entirely directed appropriately, of 500 billion rands. And that amounted to about 10% of the country's GDP. And that had nothing to do with commodities, booms, and all of that stuff. That was just the right thing to do in this moment. Now, when we think around, it's a combination of this welfarist, which I think is problematic. The welfarist food parcel approach, which was, I think, about to distribute about 250,000 food parcels across the country. I mean, in terms of wage support, there was also some kind of a temporary employer relief scheme as well, which offered funds to businesses directly or indirectly to pay wages. And these were sort of on a sliding scale of about, I think, 38% or 39% of the worker's monthly wage, and so on. And then the minimum payout for that was about 3,500 rands. So the link between this is really that it's a combination of palliative care, frankly, palliative economic care, and absorbing the short-term shocks, many of which are to do with the historical structural deficits that we've already been talking about. So the poor access to basic services. If we had a healthy healthcare system in the first instance, if we had decent health and sanitation infrastructure in the first instance, including water, accessible and clean water to all communities, we would not need to be really having the conversation around how long we're going to then continue with this, frankly, palliative care, the 350 rand being a notable example to that. But also that a healthy population, my hypothesis has always been that a healthy population is a working nation. So we cannot compromise on things like accessible healthcare. We cannot compromise on things like decent education, and education that takes place in a decent environment, not with broken windows and children walking 10, 20 kilometers a day, when we could have appropriate scholar transport, for example, when we could have appropriate street lighting and things that make it safer and easier for people to move from one place to the other at different times of the day without feeling danger. And I think these are the things that increase our quality of life. Instead, we do have a situation where it's as though, the attitude is almost as though people on the ground, people in informal settlements or in rural areas are asking for too much, and in some ways are sub-citizens, in the broader scheme of things. And that's extremely problematic. So when you're to go back to the question that you're asking around, then how does this link with the economic engine. Social infrastructure, Vuyo, is a key to certainly ensuring that the economy runs efficiently, effectively, that it's vibrant, that it's enabling, that in fact it is welcoming, that it is able to produce the sort of excitement, the energy, the vigor, because the people who are participating in the economy feel cared for, they feel invested, and they themselves are investors in this economy, not just passive recipients of state largesse, which sometimes seems to operate on mood swings, or in this case, on commodities booms.
This last question I'm posing to you because you often engage with the people at Treasury and government broadly, but also you've had opportunities in the past to form part of their internal conversations and so on. At some point, the minister seemed to be at pains trying to dispel the notion that Treasury, takes its own decisions without any due consideration to anybody else's views. And he kept on saying it is the government and not Treasury, that takes decisions on a whole host of things, including the question of a basic income grant, that it'll be the government and not Treasury necessarily. Just your thoughts around that.
A lot of people have been complaining that, Treasury is a fundamentally undemocratic institution, because if you look last year on let's take the stimulus, the president would announce this and then the Treasury would cancel. So the ANC, the ruling party, the NEC can say we want this, National Treasury will cancel. So I think he's responding to that criticism and saying that these are collective decisions that we are taking. But the problem is that we've been going on for 13 years. The government is giving us the same menu on the table. Every single budget for the past 13 years is a cut and paste of the previous budget, because the Treasury doesn't know how to do anything else. So if you just took a random budget in 2013, it will be talking about structural reforms and fiscal consolidation. So at some point, somebody must say, this is not delivering on the growth that we want for our country. So at some point, President Ramaphosa must say, hey, Mr. Finance Minister, this is not working. You've been telling me it's going to work, but it is not working. Yeah.
Okay, and that's where we're going to leave it for this evening. Special thanks to my two guests, Lebohang Pego and Duma Gqubule. Up next, we look at the life and legacy of F.W. de Klerk. As the country continues to share thoughts on the legacy of a late former President F.W. de Klerk, Lukhanyo Kalata, son of one of the Creddock Four, has expressed dismay that the former statesman took vital information about the killings of his father to his grave. The Fort Kalata Foundation has called on the NPA to accelerate the prosecution of TRC cases before more parties implicated in apartheid atrocities die without being held accountable for their actions. Lukhanyo Kalata joins me now on the line. Lukhanyo, good evening. Thanks very much for your time. You've been at this for a number of years now, and families like yours and those of Steve Biko, of Ahmed Timol, and a whole host of other struggle heroes have been saying this, that these people continue to die or their memories fade. And when it does happen, if it ever happens, there may be no one left to actually shed light on what happens to people like your father.
Well, and unfortunately, I would imagine that this is exactly what the ANC wants, and the governments that the ANC have been leading over the last 27 years. They want all people such as de Klerk, all people who perpetrated crimes against our humanity, all people who know about the murders of Fort Kalata and Sparo Konto and Matthew Goniwo and Stelo Mhlauli and Noktula Simelane and Ahmed Timol and Steve Biko and Victoria Mklenge and Mapetla Mohapi. I mean, we can go on and on and on. And I think the ANC wants all of those people, they want them all to slowly die out one by one so that they can protect the secret deals that they had entered into. As de Klerk had alluded to us earlier this year, to try and stop TRC cases from being prosecuted. So unfortunately, it seems that this is their modus operandi. And today, it's a very sad day that de Klerk has died, who's yet another criminal, who committed crimes against our humanity. He has died without ever being held accountable for the crimes that he committed against us.
Well, I mean, the last time we spoke, you had written, your foundation had written to the it filed papers actually, giving the National Prosecuting Authority, I think 2 months it was at the time, to indicate to your family and all those, the families of others, as to whether they are going to prosecute or not. And I remember one of the deputy directors of the NPA had been on the program before, where he certainly gave me and the viewers the impression that that was pretty much on track, that teams had been put together and that it was only a matter of time before we start seeing people being prosecuted. Have you heard anything or any response from the National Prosecuting Authority?
What the NPA says in public and what it does behind the scenes are two completely different things. I'll tell you that the NPA has been fighting us tooth and nail in the application that we had brought. They have missed deadlines that they were supposed to submit responses. They are making up things and just trying to delay the process as much as possible. So much so that a couple of weeks ago, I had to ask the lawyers to say, guys, what's happening here? We went to court and still there's nothing. So the lawyers then wrote to the deputy judge president in Gauteng, Justice Mlambo, and asked him to manage this matter of our application. Fortunately, the justice took pity on us and he took the matter under case management. Now, under case management, the NPA is unable to duck and dive and whatever because the judge is there and he's making sure that they are keeping their commitments. So in the meeting, I think about 2 weeks ago or last week, the NPA then gave us a firm commitment that says that by December the 2nd, they are definitely going to announce a prosecutorial decision as to whether or not they are going to prosecute any of these potential suspects that are linked to the murders of the Craddock Four. Now, obviously, de Klerk is now dead, so he can no longer be prosecuted for those crimes. But someone like Adrian Flock is still alive. Someone like Craig Williamson is still alive. Someone like Joffel van der Westhuizen is still alive. Someone like Barend du Plessis is still alive. And there are at least 11 other suspects that remain alive. So the NPA needs to move with speed so that you and I don't sit here in another couple of weeks where we are saying, oh, now Flock has died. Oh, now this one has died. The NPA needs to move with speed to ensure that those charges are brought against these individuals so that we don't have another one dying without them being held accountable for the murders of the Craddock Four.
I'm sure you'll have seen, heard, read throughout the day people talking about just how they feel about the passing of F.W. de Klerk. A lot of people saying, well, we've built this new nation on the back of forgiveness, and others saying, we shall not, or we shouldn't speak ill of the dead. Other people making the point that there are a lot of people who were struggle heroes yesterday, but if you look at the things that they have done, over the greater part of the past 27 years, how they stole the future of our children, some of them, then maybe we should be a lot more circumspect about how we feel or how we express, our feelings towards, the deaths of people like F.W. de Klerk. But from your heart, how do you feel?
Look, I mean, does the fact that de Klerk is now dead, does it minimize or does it excuse the fact that de Klerk used to sit on the State Security Council, that de Klerk was in the meetings of the State Security Council when they were discussing what to do about these two problematic teachers from a small town in the Eastern Cape, Fort Galata and Matthew Goniwa? Does that excuse the fact, now that he's dead, does it excuse the fact that he participated in the decisions to permanently remove them from society as per the military signal that was sent to the State Security Council? Does it the fact that de Klerk is now dead, does it excuse the fact that he had ordered a raid in North Crest in Mthatha, where 5 children were killed, right? Among them, twins from the Mpendulo family. Now that de Klerk is dead, does it excuse the fact that he committed those crimes against our humanity? So let's not have a revisionist kind of history about who de Klerk was. De Klerk was a suspect in the murders of the Craddock Four. The fact that the ANC chose not to prosecute him for his role in the murders of the Craddock Four doesn't all of a sudden excuse him from the crimes that he helped commit against us. De Klerk, up until his last, never admitted that apartheid was a crime against our humanity. Now that he's dead, does it mean that we must excuse him of that? The fact that de Klerk stood there in Parliament and unbanned political parties, I mean, he didn't do that because he was a kind heart. But by then, everything, this country had already suffered a state of emergency that started in 1985. Right? On the afternoon of the funeral of the Craddock Four. So all of these things that's part of de Klerk's legacy. We can't now come and rewrite his own legacy because he's dead. Okay. I mean, de Klerk never considered us as black people. He never considered us human. That's why to him, apartheid was never a crime against humanity, because he did not consider us to be human, and therefore they could have never committed crimes against our humanity. Does that excuse him that now he's dead? So people mustn't come with nonsense here. De Klerk was a murderer, and that's the end of the story.
Lukhanyo Xalata, let me thank you for your time. He is, of course, the chairperson of the Fort Galata Foundation, one of the Craddock Four families who still want the truth about what actually happened to his father and, of course, his comrades, the Craddock Four. Well, the F.W. de Klerk Foundation has released one of the former apartheid president's last videos. In his final message, de Klerk apologizes for the role he played in the country's painful past.
This is my last message addressed to the people of South Africa. To my dear wife and family, I will say goodbye in a different way. Our country faces so many challenges of a serious nature. I hold firm opinions about all of them, but decided to keep this message very short and only really focus on two issues, touching me and touching the country. Before I do so, I would like to thank all my friends and supporters for the wonderful support and encouragement they gave me throughout my life and throughout my political career. Many of them were close to me, even for decades. Others intervened occasionally. I thank you for your support and your trust in me. I thank you for your friendship. Thank you for having carried me on your shoulders for so many years. The first issue I want to focus on is apartheid and me. I'm still often accused by critics that I in some way or another continue to justify apartheid or separate development, as we later prefer to call it. It is true that in my younger years I defended separate development, as I never liked the word apartheid. I did so when I was a member of parliament, and I did so as I became a member of cabinet. Afterwards, on many occasions, I apologized for the pain and the indignity that apartheid has brought to persons of color in South Africa. Many believed me, but others didn't. Therefore, let me today, in this last message, repeat, I, without qualification, apologize for the pain and the hurt and the indignity and the damage that apartheid has done to black, brown, and Indians in South Africa. I do so not only in my capacity as the former leader of the National Party, but also as an individual. Allow me in this last message to share with you the fact that since the early 80s, my views changed completely. It was as if I had a conversion, and in my heart of hearts, realized that apartheid was wrong. I realized that we had arrived at a place which was morally unjustifiable. My conversion, to which I refer, didn't end with the admission to myself of the total unacceptability of apartheid. It motivated us in the National Party to take the initiatives we took from the time that I became leader of the National Party, and more specifically during my presidency. We did not only admit the wrongness of apartheid, we took far-reaching measures to ensure negotiations and a new dispensation which could bring justice to all. This brings me.
Well, let's quickly bring in the few minutes we have left, the Minister in the Presidency, Mondli Gungubele. Apologies, Minister. Technology was giving us problems there, getting you connected. But in the few minutes we have left, we've been playing. I don't know if you got an opportunity to listen to what F.W. de Klerk had to say in a recorded message. I think his foundation had been keeping for probably a while now, saying, he had changed his mind. He had a conversion. Not only did he admit to the wrongness of apartheid, but did cross the Rubicon in 1990. Just your thoughts.
I can't hear you, Will.
Okay. Can you hear me now, Minister?
A little bit, yes.
Just your thoughts. I mean, the president did speak earlier about the passing of F.W. de Klerk, and in a video we just played, he was talking. It's a recorded message that his foundation sent out today after his passing, where he says he had a conversion and he did apologize for apartheid. Many people did not believe him. Okay, we seem to have a problem with the minister there, unfortunately. That is where we are going to end it. But perhaps we should play you the second part of that message where F.W. de Klerk was talking about the Constitution and how he felt about people as over the past few years.
To the second issue I want to focus on. Together with most other South Africans, I'm proud of our Constitution. The Constitution which we hammered out in the negotiations which started in 1990 and which culminated in the final Constitution of 1996. I fully associate myself with the values and principles enshrined in our Constitution. And I'm deeply concerned about the undermining of many aspects of the Constitution, which we perceive almost day to day. It is my plea that the government, all parties, civil society, and all South Africans should once again embrace the Constitution and interpret it in the balanced way which the Constitution demands. We need to align the principles of non-racialism and non-discrimination with the need to deal with the past and issues like affirmative action. We need to guard over the independence and the impartiality of our courts. We need to promote economic growth and job creation by basing economic policies on the principles contained in the Constitution and not on ideologies which militate against the Constitution. We need to make the Constitution the cornerstone of the new society we are building. The road forward is a difficult one, but I firmly believe that if we take hands and if all the reasonable people in South Africa put their heads together, we can overcome the challenges we face and we can fulfill the tremendous potential that South Africa has. May the South African nation show the courage and the ingenuity to achieve this.
The late F.W. de Klerk, in a recorded message that his foundation released today after he passed on. Of course, people like Lukhanya Khalata, whom you may have seen or heard earlier, do not buy his story. They believe that he died with a lot of information that could really help them find the truth about what happened to their families who were killed by the apartheid regime. We will, of course, continue to explore these matters over the next few days as we reflect on the life of this man, F.W. de Klerk. For today, though, that brings us to the end of the show. Do join us again tomorrow evening at 8 o'clock in the evening. Good night.